Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to All About Ibogaine, a Thursday conversation that um, is hosted by Awake.net and me in particular. Um, I started it right after Trump's executive order about Ibogaine, fast tracking Ibogaine for addiction, and because a lot of new people will be coming to the subject of Ibogaine and psychedelics in general from all around the world. And I felt like we needed to have a place where people with a lot of experience in these subjects could share their knowledge because um, psychedelic medicines, plant medicines like Ibogaine, psilocybin, ayahuasca are really powerful plant medicine journeys that affect you on all levels, body, mind, and spirit. And in truth, healing is also happening on all levels, body, mind, and spirit. So for today's discussion, I'm really excited to introduce Sarah Salter Kelly, who's the author of the book Trauma as Medicine. And we're going to have a conversation about her origin story and her lived experience of trauma in her life. And like I was saying just before we started recording, I've been thinking about trauma myself. And I think everyone, all of us, are subject to traumas of one kind or another, whether it's the death of a parent or the death of a child. One is a much bigger. Both are big traumas: death of a parent, death of a child, or something that happens to you when you're younger or when you're older, at war, while you're a child. And these things shape your character. And for me, there is a state of consciousness that I have found post trauma that is very powerful and balanced and whole. And I stepped into it after I had gone through a period of healing my trauma. And so this is why I'm so interested in the subject and what Sarah has to say about it. Um, so please welcome Sarah Salter Kelly.
Thank you, Lakshmi. I'm excited to be here on the call with all of you today and endeavor to share what I can that can be of service in addressing the hard things.
Yeah, that's great, Sarah. I was wondering if you could share with us kind of your origin story of how you came to the subject of the book, and what led you to it, and how it how you moved through it, and what your message really is. Trauma as medicine, what is that message? It's such a powerful title. And please take your time, we have 2 hours, so.
Yeah, absolutely, Lakshmi. I think it's important to preface that I speak of addressing trauma through the lens of lived experience and a background in energy healing and earth medicine traditions. And so my approach in many ways came because there were no other resources that I could find to address hard things other than what I discovered inside of myself when I was quiet enough to listen. I also think it's important for people who are on the call or listening to the recording to be conscious of any potential triggers or activations that might come up within yourself while I'm speaking, because I'm going to speak about hard things. And since I have been doing this for many years, I'm quite comfortable in speaking candidly about trauma, but the same isn't true for everybody who's listening. And so, if there's contraction that shows up in your nervous system, giving yourself a few moments to take some breaths and just be present with what is here for you. Um, let's see. First off, I'm going to do a tie-in into psychedelics because I have no experience with Iboga or Ibogaine. My background 35 years ago would have been with LSD and psilocybin recreationally, and then about 20 years experience with psilocybin and ayahuasca ceremonially. Uh, and I'm getting distracted because I'm noticing that my camera keeps zooming in and out. Hopefully it's not showing up completely on the recording, but but that's distracting. Uh, so my book, Trauma as Medicine, is about my lived experience of addressing the homicide and rape and kidnapping of my mother, Sheila Salter, which happened in 1995. And so back in 1995, I was a 20-year-old woman who, like most 20-year-old women or humans, felt like I had life figured out. I had most of the answers. And I had actually been on my own since a young age, at about 15 years old. And I, through that experience, had had to develop an awareness of my own intuition and connection to spirit because I went from the suburbs to the downtown inner core in the city of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And the reason why I include that in the segue into addressing my mother's homicide is because I had a sense of confidence that I knew who I was. I had had to do hard things already. I'd had to find resources to survive, to feed myself, to find shelter. I had a great partner who 32 years later is still my partner. And I had discovered a path in spirituality, which I was quite dedicated to, which was goddess-based traditions. And so my mother was a life coach. And back in the early 90s, life coaching was not a thing like it is now. And I had this sense that she was doing, good service-based work. And part of the naivety that can show up when we have this level of altruism towards how one's life path perhaps is unfolding is that there's a sense that the really bad things can happen to the ones who are doing the good work. Or at least that was some of the belief that I had at that age of 20. And through that naivety, the deep grief and trauma that I then went through in the subsequent years meant I had to unpack all of my beliefs and all of my ideas and all of my understanding of who I was. And so I'll backtrack a little bit. On December 7th of 1995, my mother was attacked in the parking garage of her workplace by a stranger. And it's actually a really small percentage of people who are attacked and murdered by strangers. It's often family members. It's also one of the things that most women are most afraid of being in a dark place, being accosted by a bad guy and not having the power to protect yourself. And so she was missing for 10 days. We did not know what had happened to her. There was evidence of blood on the floor of the parking garage, as well as her briefcase and gloves. And throughout the course of that 10 days, when we're in a shock or deep trauma response, our body is in such profound contraction of trying to figure out how to be with what's present. I remember looking out the windows of the house that I lived in and watching people go to work or go about their routine and being so challenged by how the rest of the world can be going through normal life and everything that I knew had fallen apart. I mean, seeing your family member on the news with every newscast and hearing the little pieces that insinuate what may or may not have happened to her and doing your best to hope for the hope for the best, wish for the best, if you will, and yet knowing somewhere on some level that the chances of her turning up okay were pretty slim. And so my family organized a press conference after she'd been missing for a few days. Her vehicle had turned up. There had been a search right after her death or right after she went missing. However, there was so much snow that fell in that time period that they had to call off the search because there was no way that they would be able to find any tire tracks. So we held this press conference in the hopes that if anybody knew anything, that they would offer up some tips or something that they might have seen. And somebody came forward who had actually purchased a ring of hers. This is how we figured out what happened uh, at a bar on the day that she went missing. And so she didn't have a lot of jewelry, but she had one of a kind ring that my dad had given to her for Christmas a few years prior. And when we received that tip, or when the police did, they were able to put a name to the person who allegedly had harmed her. And so at that moment, Peter John Bright Eyes um, was wanted in her disappearance. There was a Canadian wide warrant for his arrest. The next day, so this is 10 or 11 days after she went missing, a farmer was going out to an abandoned farmhouse on his land, I think to bring in a wood stove, and he found her body partially clad, frozen in the farmhouse. And so we now had a bad guy, and now we had um, the answer to what had happened to her. And the problem with the answer is that you now have to be with what happened. You now have to digest this horribly unexpected, unfathomable experience of something this desecrating can happen to my mother, to somebody that I love so deeply, and there's nothing that I could do or could have done to prevent it. Following the next year, there was a preliminary hearing, and then there was a trial. Now, Bright Eyes had turned himself in and pled not guilty. He did have my mother's blood on his shoes, and throughout the course of the trial, the evidence that he had, um, DNA evidence from him having raped her, was brought up in the trial. You know, amongst other things, that it made it 100% sure that this was the bad guy. And like discovering her body, is that the problem with having a bad guy is that you now have the bad guy. You can put a face to what happened, and we think that that will give us some level of closure or some level of peace, but it doesn't. Our bodies and our nervous systems still have to digest and be with the consequences of such unspeakable, unfathomable experiences. About 4 weeks after Bright Eyes was found guilty of murder one in Canada, this was March of 1997, he suicided in prison. And I remember after that feeling just in such a state of despair, because I had such conviction and certainty that there's purpose and meaning in life. And now I had to be with this great dilemma of what's the point? My mom is dead, this person is dead, and what's the point of it all? You know? And I would say that over the course of the next few years, a lot of what I was processing in my self physically, mentally, and emotionally was being with that whole curiosity. What's the point of it all? What does it all mean? Taking some of the beliefs and framework of my own ideology out, and choosing which ones I picked back up and claimed as my own. And so the thing with big T trauma is that we have to be with the absolute discomfort of uncertainty when all of our convictions fall to the wayside. And that's the challenge. That's a challenge for us as humans, I think, period, no matter what. We want to surmise that we have a level of control over our reality. And so when we meet death, when we meet trauma, all of a sudden we're faced with the truth that we don't necessarily have the same amount of control that we think. And what are we going to do about that? How are we going to be with that? I did not pursue a lot of help as far as therapy went at that time period. Now, some of it was I didn't have the money for it. You know, there wasn't any coverage. And having been a bit of a street punk in those early years, hopefully I can swear, I had a fuck you all, figure out how to do it myself mentality. And and certainly would have received some feedback from people as far as oh God, murder, you know, you're kind of screwed. You're stuck with that. There's no getting over that. And so part of the energy that I can recognize now at 50 that drove some of my motivation in those early years was to heck with all of you or what anybody else has to say. I am going to figure out how to be with this. I'm going to figure out how to come to a place of freedom. And I would say, even at that young age, the intention for freedom was conscious. You know, how do I be with what's showing up? And so that meant making a lot of space to feel and experience my grief. Something that often is we don't allow space for in our world or in our culture. I remember that I had a few months off from the job that I worked at, which was in a record store and a music store when my mom died. And I received a notification from the, would be the Workers' Compensation Board, I think, in Canada at that time, that 2 months should be adequate for my grief experience, and writing them this long letter entailing the you know how like what I thought about that. And sometimes now I think about like the poor person who received that letter, who was all having to follow a dysfunctional system. And it's just what it is, right? It's what it is. And
Before
one of
you,
the go
sorry,
ahead, Lakshmi.
I just want to, one of the things you said, about how you decided, I don't really give a damn what anyone says. I'm going to find my way through this. I'm going to heal myself. It's kind of what you said. And that level of intentionality is so important for any kind of healing to happen. So I just want to underscore it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. And that's one of the reasons why I share my story and wrote the book and have taught programs to support people in addressing trauma over these last 20 years. Because the fact of the matter is that we're the only ones who can do it also, which means that we have to be with, digest, and investigate our hard things, what we're afraid of. We have to make space to listen to what our body is telling us. And from a place of vigilance and dedication. And that's the piece that I think is often missing. Often my clients that come to me are at midlife or older. And one of the pieces that I'm supporting them in investigating is some of the older wounds that, as we all know, over the course of time, they don't go away. They don't go away. And I had enough experience in the first formative years I was on my own that I had to count on myself. And if I counted on myself, I could feel my connection with spirit. And I was the one who was going to pave a way through. And so that was very true in those first 10 years in my 20s after mom died. Everybody in my family had different ways of being with her death, as is true in all families. And many of them didn't resonate with me to the same depth of what I needed. I needed to feel it until the feelings moved and changed. And in many ways, it took me those 10 years to be with the loss around mom. It was helpful that she had been a life coach and so had then influenced a lot of the formation of some of my the ways in which I see myself or the world. And so I was instilled with this sense of we choose everything in our life. Everything happens for a reason. There's no accidents. And these can sometimes, come up as woo-woo new age sayings. But as I deepened into them over that course of time, and I could feel my mom's spirit talking to me saying, Sarah, everything happens for a reason. There's no accidents. And I would say, yeah, Mom, I used to believe you. Then you were accosted and murdered in a dark place. So I'm having a hard time getting on board with your advice. And yet, as I sat with it, I allowed for my own curiosity to lead the way. And I thought, okay, I'm willing to play. What if everything happens for a reason? What if there are no accidents? What happens in my body as I start to feel into that belief system or that sensation? And as a person who spends a lot of time outside in nature and on the land, certainly the reflection, if you're out for a hike in the forest and every single thing that you see, you can recognize belongs in the forest. From the lush living trees to the ones that are half rotten and decomposting, and maybe they have parasites, and all of the little bits that are a part of the land, yet somehow everything fits. Somehow everything belongs. So I made a conscious decision to choose that somehow all of this fit together in the tapestry of who I am, even if I don't know what that means. And so that was a lot of the precursor to me following my intuition as I investigated what I was sensing and feeling throughout my 20s. And it was really important for me to come to peace with how mom died. And so initially that included a few things in those first few years, and that was facing my fear. I was really afraid of going into that parkade, for one. I had been in there once with my mom a couple of weeks before she died, and my first response to her was, "Wow, Mama, it's really creepy in here."
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of lighting. It maybe fit 20 cars. It was a street level parking garage. And she said she had been parking on the street and her car got broken into. So she had started to park back in the parkade, and that she would be speaking to the owner of the building about um, improving the lighting. This was where her workplace was. And so I needed to go back in there. Maybe at first I wondered if it was haunted. Initially, I need to make sure she wasn't there. I think with some of it, when I look back on my 21, 22, 23-year-old young self, and I needed to be with any fear that came up with for me through that. So I did that a few times, creating my own ceremony or saying my own prayers or singing. I remember going there and singing Amazing Grace and just listening to what needed to be done to move this energy in my body. Another thing that was really challenging for me was being afraid to walk alone at night because I had been someone who loved walking under the moonlight, and I found that I was terrified. And so I remember after about a year and a half, 2 years, making myself walk at night with my dog. But still, and the thing about fear is that we can feel it on our body. Hey, like you can feel all the hackles of your skin go up, and um and it starts to tell us through triggers or activation that we will die, that the worst possible thing is going to happen. And so I took my time with it. And interestingly enough, at that point in my life, my then boyfriend, now husband, we were living about 8 blocks from where she had been murdered. And so I made myself walk on the same street at night. A few things like that, in a still in a conscious and safe way, but to address that fear inside of my body. And so I think that that speaks to a couple of pieces for all of us with trauma, is that some of it are the ways in which we physically have activations that are connected to our deepest fear that we need to move into. We also have the investigation of what it means, especially when we're speaking about grief and loss. Where is the person? What's happened? How do we know that's true? How does it impact our spiritual beliefs or our ideas of what's next? And so again, I took a lot of time to speak with and feel into whether or not I sensed that mom was at peace, um, what other core wounds I had connected to her loss, such as needing needing to forgive her for things, needing to forgive myself, needing to recognize it wasn't my fault. You know, all of those pieces that show up in grief and trauma that become heavy energy in our system. And if we're not willing to confront them or face them, they actually keep us from seeing clearly. Right? It's like we end up with these horse blinders on, and over the course of time, they become smaller and smaller when we're unwilling to address that contraction. At about the 10-year mark, and note, Lakshmi, you can stop me at any time to ask a question.
Anyone, and that goes for everyone too. Just
Yeah, it goes for everyone. And so at about the 10-year mark, I had this deep awareness that I was at peace with losing mom. You know, I actually, as I've mentioned, I had been pursuing my own path and earth medicine, exploring energy healing and shamanism and many other modalities that help us to align more deeply with the sacred. And I was standing outside on my driveway, and I had children at that time. I had children in my 20s. So I had twins at that point that would have been 5, and my son 1. And I remember, I think I was just going into the house for something. And I felt this wind come up to me, and I knew I had to pause and stop. And I was facing the east direction. And in that wind, I felt my mother's spirit take me through all aspects of her death until she left. And then when she showed me her death, I was overcome by this really deep uh, experience of grace. That's the best way in our English language to describe it. Unlike anything I've experienced as a human. So I knew that she was showing me that she was okay. But I also knew in my felt sense that I didn't feel okay. And here's what was true. In those 10 years, I had never addressed my anger towards the person who had killed her. And so I had done the work within myself in relation to mom and digesting murder and homicide to the best of my ability. But I had never gotten mad. You know, I had used so many excuses in my head as a reason to not go into that. You know, I knew that Peter Bright Eyes had been in the system most of his life. He'd only been out of prison for about 5 days before he killed my mom. So he had been in prison most of his adult life. I think he was about 33 when he killed her. And he'd been in the foster care system a lot of his childhood. And he was an Indigenous man. So a lot of the consequences of colonial trauma had impacted his life. And I was conscious of that to some extent at that time. And because of that awareness, felt like, well, what's the point? You know, he went through a lot of suffering, and mom is already dead. What's the point of getting angry? And who likes getting angry? Who likes that feeling in their body? But I couldn't lie to myself. Not getting angry meant betraying myself. And so the next part of this story was, how do you express your anger towards somebody who is dead and dive deeper into the feelings showing up in your body? And this is back in 2006. And certainly our world was not quite as trauma informed as it is now. I remember initially going to see a psychologist. And I probably didn't pick a psychologist in the best way, you know. I took, for those of you who remember the yellow pages, I just took this phone book and I flipped it and I stuck my finger in the spot under psychologist. I'm like, that's the one I'm going to work with. Inevitably, it led me in the right direction. But I remember speaking to this woman and sharing how I could feel the presence of Peter Bright Eyes around me, and that his image, and this is true for many people who go through trauma, his image would show up in my most intimate moments. as if to sabotage what was happening. And I couldn't make him go away. I tried for about a year and I felt this anger brewing in my body and I didn't know what to do with it. And so this was what I articulated to the therapist at the time. And unfortunately, her suggestion was to imagine him surrounded by pink light. That was the initial suggestion. Why don't you just imagine him surrounded by pink light? And I kind of looked at her like she was a little crazy. And she was she was older. She was in her 60s. And so, you know, I surmised as a 30-year-old that would have had some experience in addressing hard things. And I said, I don't think that's going to be strong enough for me. And so then she said, why don't you imagine him in a hot air balloon slowly floating away? And I just looked at her and I didn't tell her what I wanted, which was to jump into my wolf body and tear him apart. And she probably would have recommended medication at that point. And so I just left that appointment thinking, okay, Sarah, initially disappointed, and then you can do this. You know, you know how to create ceremony, you know how to create ritual. You're going to create your own ritual and you're going to call him in and you're going to address him. And so part of my process over the next 9 months was trusting that I could do that and believing in that and making space at least once a week for about an hour and a half to be with the feelings that needed to be addressed without a plan. And so that's a really important part. We can have tools that can act as vehicles for going deeper into our felt sense. But if we have the plan of what the outcome is, we're going to stay in our head.
Oh.
And so my plan very much was I'm going to go into meditation. If I need to sing, dance, shout, I'll do that. If I need to drum, if I need to cry, if I need to write letters or have a fire, I'm going to do these things. And note, I have a very pragmatic approach to ceremony and ritual because my son, who would have been about 8 months old, slept for an hour and a half. So I knew I had an hour and a half, and my twin girls were in kindergarten in the mornings. So I I had time. I thought I actually had a lot of time. Um, and so through that, miracles came through. And it's really important that I speak to that because we think miracles are something that happens to other people or all of a sudden a hallelujah moment shows up and there's this sense of great light opening and you have all the answers and you know all the things. And that certainly wasn't my experience. What my experience was is that through getting really angry, through acknowledging the truth that I was victimized, right? That I did go through that loss, through shouting at him and calling him out and naming all of the components that needed to be acknowledged within myself. Obviously, I wasn't expecting him to acknowledge it. He was dead. But I needed to speak it out loud for me. I needed to say what wasn't fair, what wasn't just, what wasn't okay, so that I was honoring and acknowledging the part of me that was so hurt.
Hmm.
And so
Can
they're,
I
yeah, yeah, please.
can I ask you a couple questions about that? So one is, now in hindsight or then, did you think that when you saw his presence around you, that it was his spirit in some, otherworldly form, or that it was a projection of your own psyche and subconscious about what needed to be healed?
That's a great question. I think they're both the same.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so too. But do you?
And so at the time, I didn't know initially. I knew I had to speak to him. And as I said, I could see him showing up in my mind's eye. It would be moments like when I was breastfeeding my babies or when I was about to make love to my husband or something really intimate. All of a sudden, his face would show up. And no matter what I did, I couldn't make it go away. So I feel like when I reflect back on that, it would be the higher knowing within my own self that um, was pointing out this was the next place in my journey for me to address. And I also think it was his spirit.
Mm.
And certainly throughout the course of the rest of the story, there's some pieces that come together on that. But here's the other thing, Lakshmi. It doesn't matter. When it comes to somebody, like somebody doesn't have to get on board with that idea, is what I'm saying.
Mhm.
When it comes to addressing contraction within ourselves, we simply need to address the contraction. There might be somebody that comes from my background who very much believes it's an ancestral spirit or a spirit that needs to be spoken to. There might be somebody else who's just noticing the voice of their little girl, or little boy, little child self that is hurt and needs to articulate that hurt and have it valued enough that it's worth speaking. And so the important part is that it's spoken. The important part is that it's acknowledged and tended to. Because when we give ourselves permission to speak from that really raw place, something changes in our whole experience of ourselves. And the other piece is that over the course of speaking it out loud, it also changes. As angry as I would get in the first few months of doing this ceremony, after I was about halfway through, the anger wasn't there in the same way. And I wanted it to be there,
Mhm.
in my head. But as I would go to check in with my body, it had started to change. And so sometimes it seems like we can be so reluctant to go into the places inside of us that are holding these really hard feelings because of what we're afraid might happen if we go there,
Right.
which is often based on belief systems that we've acquired in those first 7 years of our lives about what it means to feel, and so when we give ourselves permission, then it changes inside of ourselves.
Right.
And so halfway through that, after about 3 or 4 months of, sometimes screaming and shouting, sometimes meditating, just deeply excavating from my own soul, like what needs to be spoken to so I can be free. My intention was freedom. My intention wasn't like because I hate this guy and he deserves this and or it wasn't to acquire anything other than liberation from my being because I could feel that I was contracted. And if there was
Right.
anything in my power, anything I could be responsible for, then I wanted to make sure that I tended to that. And so that's the piece that was very much intentional and through choice. There's something that I can do here. I can feel this dark energy around me, and it is keeping me from feeling present or feeling safe or feeling okay in my body, therefore in my life.
Right.
And if I can do something different, what would it be? And that was the energy motivating some of that ceremony. And as I've said, this was a 9-month ceremony. That wasn't my plan at the time because I didn't have a plan other than to be with the feelings until they changed.
Well, your plan was to be free. That was the
But
plan.
yes,
And I think
yes,
that's super important that, you have, so you were talking about little miracles and things lining up and you having this intention to be free. So I have found that intentions can come at different frequency levels, and some of them have a kind of purity and rightness about them that open up synchronicity in what you're trying to do. And when you're going through a journey like healing your own trauma, um, you come to junctures where your energy sinks really low, and you have to realign yourself with your intention to be free for the energy to come back up again. So that core intention and carrying it forward, it becomes like a strength for you as a person. Just that's been my experience, and I'm sure it's been yours too, from your reaction. Yeah.
absolutely, Lakshmi. And the miracle point, to circle back to that, is I would say when the course of my life changed in many ways is after about 3 or 4 months of this ceremony, I had this unexpected vision. And so similar to when you're in a deep meditation or you're being led on a journey. Because I have been practicing meditation since I was a kid, my mom had meditation tapes that I would use. It became quite familiar to me to go deeply and trust in what I was seeing. And so anyhow, I felt myself sitting on this sand wall with my arm around a little boy who was about 8 or 9 years old, maybe 10. And before me was this small pyramid. And I was comforting this little boy as if he was my child and encouraging him to go to this pyramid where he was having to be accountable for something that he did wrong. Right. And so I'm encouraging him, you could do this. And then all of a sudden, my conscious mind kicked in. It was almost like waking up from a dream. And I recognized that I was the woman and this little boy was Peter Bright Eyes. And I had had this deep sense of compassion for him in that experience. And as my conscious mind pulled me out, certainly there was a lot of, like, what the heck? How could I feel that? I felt like I betrayed my family. How could I have those feelings for this guy? He's such a bad guy. This is incredulous. You know, I was just in shock by the feelings coming through me. And then the fact that I couldn't get rid of the compassion,
What a
which
problem
was, which
to have.
Yeah, which was very true over the next few months or even year, I would say, as I was digesting this experience of there was still anger in my system, but now there was this sense of compassion in my system, and they created such a sense of conflict and heaviness because I didn't know what to do with it. And there wasn't a thing to do other than be with and be curious about this sense of compassion. Over the course of time, I allowed myself to, which meant learning to let go of what other people would think. And as I started to be curious about who he was, because that's a lot of what sparked inside of me. Somebody doesn't just wake up one day and end up being a bad guy with a knife in the back of a parkade.
Yeah.
There has to be a lot of events in place that lead up to the formation of that human experience. And I wanted to know what they were. I wanted to know what had transpired or happened for him to be that person. And I also, because I had such an experience of shared humanity in this vision, that I also recognized that a part of me had felt superior to him over the course of the 10 years previous, not necessarily even consciously, but he was a bad guy who horribly raped and murdered my mother. And so obviously I was better.
So there was
And
this righteous anger and righteous
absolutely.
goodness.
And even if it was in a subtle goody two shoes way, it was still there. And so that was part of the equalizing ground, I
Yeah.
would say, is that when I would sit down in my meditations, recognizing and taking ownership for that. Because as I sat with this seed of compassion, the message I was receiving from spirit is that I wasn't any better than him. He wasn't in a place of purgatory. He wasn't, like, because he had done bad things, that we come here to learn certain things. And part of my journey meant listening more and more to what was coming through. And as I had said earlier, I had this belief of or sense of knowing in my body, what if there is, no accidents? What if everything happens for a reason? Show me. And I want to be free. So show me. I will do anything within my power to listen, to shift, to change this. And that's what was showing up. And I was pretty conscious of that. Sarah, you asked for freedom. Guess freedom means getting to know more about this person. And through the course of the times that I sat with his spirit every week, it it really felt that way on all levels until I was no longer afraid of him. And that was around the time that I completed that ceremony with a fire and with gratitude and with more willingness to listen to how else I was being guided
Hmm.
and what could that look like, right? With that deep, the pursuit, maybe not even the pursuit of meaning, because that implies that we're needing to search. I think just coming back to that forest analogy, that somehow everything fits. We belong, we're enough, the right things are unfolding. And if I can rest in that, then and listen for any and all of us, then we're guided in such a way that we're directed towards what we need to see. And so it was actually after my experience with Peter Bright Eyes that I started doing some ceremonial work with ayahuasca. I started going to Peru, in 2008 and worked with ayahuasca in traditional retreat centers, throughout the next 10 or so years.
Yeah.
And what I loved about ayahuasca, and I believe is true for many psychedelics, is that it engages our felt sense to show us what we have been avoiding, what we have been pretending isn't there. And from a mythical lens, and the mythos is really important because when we are trying to quantify our trauma and make sense of it, where it fits into an articulated box, it's always bigger than that. It's always bigger than that. And we end up feeling fragmented, or we make ourselves smaller to suit somebody else's idea of what healing is supposed to look like. When we're working with the mythos, it can be so expansive that it includes everything. And that was certainly part of what helped in my own digestion in working with ayahuasca and psilocybin in a ceremonial way. What what I think is important to speak to is that the psychedelics are helping us gain greater insight
Yeah.
into how we can be present with what is already in our bodies, what is already here.
I call it a shift in perspective. So you get this perspective shift, and in a way, you're a slave to your perception. However you see it, is the box you're inside of, and the box becomes bigger with psychedelics, and you have this shift in perspective, which is what allows you to maybe see yourself as a victim with compassion, see the perpetrator with compassion, or whatever the dynamics are of the situation going on.
Absolutely. And it also brings the responsibility back to ourselves because we recognize that we're able to respond and that we get to choose how we respond to what is unfolding in this life experience, especially, as conscious adults, when we're not in the experience of trauma anymore, but we're so often reacting to life as if we are.
Oh, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a great point.
Yeah. And so that's a really piece that's important to be conscious of. And definitely in the work I support people with psilocybin and being conscious of our nervous system regulation, then we're able to discern and investigate what is the difference between my reaction and my response. You know, how can I be present enough with intensity or what is uncomfortable and simply be with the energy of that sensation without reacting based on the core wounds that are the roots of our reactions. And of course, there's deeper processes, as I'm sure everybody on the call is aware of, that can help us to go into the roots of that reaction, into the abandoned parts of our younger selves, or the
So
component.
can I
Please.
just, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but can I just make a point here about what you're saying, what it reminds me of? So, mind control. And so when you're in this unresolved trauma state, where you haven't engaged with it consciously, the mind control that's happening is basically the articulation and how you're kind of containing it and telling yourself what it is or not telling yourself what it is, whatever that might be. But what you're describing is a shift in mind control where you're still controlling by intention, by focusing your attention, but your mind is focusing on the feelings. That's kind of what I just saw as you were describing
Mm,
this. So the
mm,
mind control has shifted to be more proactive towards
mm, mm.
addressing things.
That capacity to be proactive is what is so essential. And this is why it's also really important for us to make space to investigate our triggers. Throughout the course of any day, all of us are going to have some sort of trigger, some sort of activation inside of our body. And often, if it's little, maybe somebody cuts you off while you're driving and you know, spew a whole bunch of rage words at them, and then go about your day. Just think, I don't, that's not something worthy of investigating. Surely there's bigger things that I need to look at than that, right? But the thing is that how we do one thing is how we do most things. And so making that space to be curious as to what is that energy inside of myself that went into such deep contraction and reaction, and how can I care for it differently
Mm.
in order to change that? Because if we're in that place where we're going into triggers and it's the little things that help us, there's a really long lineup at the superstore, like all of these kinds of
Mhm.
things that
Yeah,
end up activating our the true nature, I think,
yeah.
of how we engage with or participate with life. And so that is limited by our perspective and our belief systems. And, to use the term that you were referencing with the ways in which we can control parts of our mind and how we see things, we have to be aware of it in order to apply some of that discernment.
So that awareness itself becomes a sort of distance between just feeling the thing unconsciously to becoming aware of it. And so then you have a little bit more detachment just with that awareness.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
And so feeling becomes a little easier to manage or look at.
exactly. Enough breathing space to be curious. Another great trigger for many of us is family. And so there's all of these ways that we can look at how we how we metabolize or deal with contraction. And you can bet they're rooted back into unaddressed grief and trauma from our early years.
Mhm.
And that's what you're wanting to investigate inside of yourself so that you are in a deeper place of freedom and that you're not reacting to life from a place that's powerless because you're blowing up over activations and then justifying them according to some of the ways in which our egos can allow for our own small-mindedness to lead the way through righteousness, through conviction, through certainty, superiority, judgment, right? And if we're looking at a lot of what's happening on our planet, there is a deep call for equanimity. There's a call for balance, which means that we have to do the work of creating balance inside of ourselves.
Yeah,
And
for sure. It's an ongoing process, lifelong process of, they call it cultivation in the in Taoist, cultivation or refinement. So it goes on. But for people who are coming out of Ibogaine treatment for addiction or PTSD or trauma, I think what you're saying is really applicable to that process because getting rid of the addictive substance in your body, um, having that reset that Ibogaine gives you is like the first step. But then there's a whole bunch of accumulated conditioning habits, ways of being that you had around the addiction pattern in your life that then you have to, you as the person going through the journey post Ibogaine has to unravel, kind of like what you're talking about. It's a long process, you know. So, and there's a lot of traumas associated with that as well, and family things and triggers. And so everything you're talking about is really powerful and useful for somebody going through integration post Ibogaine. Just
Yeah, the integration is the most important part because it is that deepening into how do you create the map between the mythic and the mundane? You know, how do we um, trust that the experiences from the deep ceremonial work that can show up with plant medicine, that we can care for those awarenesses in our day to day? And so resources need to be in place for healthy integration. And those are the containers that help to form the direction of how we carry it in the world. Those resources can be like imagining the banks of the river, and your process is the flow of water. If the banks are not in place, then the water is just gonna spread out and flood all over the land and disintegrate, you know? And that often can be the case. Sometimes I'll see people post psychedelic ceremonies, you know, with this fervor of, I'm going to change everything. I'm going to go home. I'm going to do all like this. Great. I'm going to do it all now, you
right,
know? And I have this deep encouragement of, I wonder how you could keep it simple so that it's sustainable and nourishing at the same time, that then actually encourages greater follow through, greater flow.
right.
Whereas that impulsive energy is actually kind of addictive if you think of it. To do all of the things now, post ceremony, creates that rush and then often that collapse.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so it's that willingness to follow through and show up for ourselves.
Yeah, there's also, you know, there's also can be a great sense of dissatisfaction after having done a powerful psychedelic journey where you've looked at yourself, a great sense of dissatisfaction with yourself when you come back into quote unquote normal reality or your normal state of consciousness. For me anyway, it was like I felt like I had to bridge the gap between who I saw myself as, the potential of who I could be, that I
Mm,
felt and lived inside of, and who I was in my life. And that's the arc of transformation right there between those two.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it takes time. And certainly what I often remind people of is that it took how many years or how many decades to create the life experience up until this moment. So it's going to take time
Right.
to shift the parts of ourselves that we recognize don't actually align with the truth of who we are. And it's that discomfort, I think, of the lack of alignment is what shows up through our psychedelic experiences of going, oh, wow, some of the ways in which I treat myself or in which I treat others or these relationships or these components need to be cared for in a different way if I'm actually going to be honest and follow through on why I feel like I'm here.
Right. And it's such an inner conversation. Like while you can turn to therapists or ceremonies or all of that, it's an inner day-to-day conversation of minutia. A lot of times it's small things like small moments of response, you know, in your day that you're shifting
Hmm.
uh, in order to um, weave a better version of yourself or a version that you love rather than one that you are unhappy with.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes I think that part of the waking up moment for many people is even realizing that they can. You know, realizing that they can do something different. We're so inundated with this framework of ideology that we need external support to do the deep internal things. And although we need having loving community and resources around us are really essential, we are still the only ones who can do those big things.
Yeah.
You know, we can dive into that underworld of our own soul's journey and be honest about what we need to take accountability for and and what we need to acknowledge and what is actually real, you know, without the bullshit in
That's right.
our recognition of who we are. We have
Right.
to do that piece.
It's really time and space. Like you said, you had
Mhm.
a hour and a half to meditate and or go within. Time and space to go within and be with yourself.
Yeah. And I think it's that commitment and dedication. And I'm certainly noticing more and more of that is present when, now, as opposed to 30 years ago, a lot of things that I might have felt nobody had ever heard of that was important to me in spiritual healing or personal growth now is a lot more commonplace.
Oh,
And so there is a lot of movement. Um, I think when we step out of the threat of fear that can be so present on our planet, we can recognize actually there's a lot of movement. And so, what I want to speak to goes even a little bit deeper into collective healing, Lakshmi. And in continuing with the thread of the story, once I had, for the most part, made peace with Peter Bright Eyes, I had another vision in which it was suggested to me, and when I say vision, it actually wasn't with any plant medicine. It was just through some ceremonial work with some teachers I was working with in Southern Oregon. uh I pronounced Oregon like a Canadian. Hey, I never know how to say it.
yeah.
I've been corrected before and I just realized that. Um, but anyhow, and in this vision, I was encouraged to go and find out more about his people. And so the encouragement was, Sarah, you need to go and find the bones of his ancestors, the bones of your ancestors, and put them together in a way that brings balance inside of yourself.
Mm,
This was 2010, which meant that I reached out to the First Nation that he was from and received a response from their chief and council where I was put in touch with a former chief who I ended up working with.
mm,
Simultaneously, I also guessed and reached out to a woman I figured was his sister on Facebook. And and that was really hard and really uncomfortable because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what I wanted. I just knew that I needed to connect with her. And I guess on some level, I wanted to learn more about her brother. And I was really lucky in that she was completely willing to connect with me and respond. So around the same time, I was having some conversations with her, and she wasn't living on their reserve anymore. When I went to the reserve to meet with this former chief, I was really given a profound initiation, if you will, in the consequences of colonization in Canada, the impact of residential schools, and many other components that I hadn't been conscious of
mm,
through the lens of my own white privilege, really. And over the course of the following few years, I ended up being invited to hold circles through this former chief and some of the events that he organized. And I would say that I learned more from the elders that were in the circle that were sharing their stories than I did through some of the stories that I was sharing. It became a really important part of coming full circle in my own journey and understanding a little bit more of what had come to pass in order for Bright Eyes to become that bad guy. It also helped me to have a framework to understand how trauma belongs to all of us.
mm,
That at some level, it certainly was through the consequences of my ancestors fleeing um, the experiences that they were having in Europe to come to this land that it then impacted his ancestors. So the deep recognition of how tied we are to each other.
mm,
When I eventually was able to meet his sister in person, it was around 2015, and we started doing some talks together. And that was also deeply therapeutic and some of the hardest things I've ever done. I remember this experience of sitting with her at her kitchen table, and she had a photo album out and was doing her best to share what she could about her family and her brother, though he was about, I think, 13 years older than her. And all of a sudden, at one point, she flipped the page of the photo album, and there was his face. And my body went into a deep trauma response. Like I couldn't breathe. I felt myself contracting. This voice in my head saying, like, Sarah, what are you doing? This is crazy. This is crazy. Nobody does this. Why are you doing this? And then I was able to take a breath and really felt my mom's spirit with me and that encouragement of I'm going to find a different way to be with this
Mm.
than want vengeance, than be angry, than hate. I need to find a different way forward. And that whole experience was probably only 30 seconds, right? And I was able to exhale and take that time to learn more about who he was and even through that experience have a sense of acknowledgement of through Marilyn, his sister, of the devastation that her brother had caused my family. So there was, it's an interesting thing. I think for many of us in our healing journey, we want a sense of acknowledgement, and we're typically the ones who have to give ourselves that acknowledgement.
Mm.
We have to be the ones that say, "You're worthy, you're enough, it's okay, I've got you." And yet, if we really put our prayers out to the universe, we receive that response, often not in the places where we expect it or the
Yeah,
places where we want it.
so true.
And it was actually Marilyn and I were doing a talk together, and she was sharing her own experience of recovery, of she's under the FASD umbrella, of growing up in the violence of her family home, and I was sharing my story of mom's death. And at some point when she shared, she stopped herself and she just says, I'm really sorry. That must have been so hard.
Mm.
And a few other words. And because we were doing this story share um, at a place called the Blue Quill College, which is a former residential school, and I had asked for there to be elders and support if needed because of the content of what we were speaking of. They actually stopped us then and offered some prayers and some songs, um and it was really powerful for both of us and for all that were there. And so when we put that prayer out to the universe or that intention of, okay, show me. I don't I don't know how to necessarily make sense of this, but I'm willing to listen and I'm willing to trust in who I am and what my journey is and the shit or the stuff that's showing up along the way.
Yeah.
And somehow I can alchemize that. And
Oh,
in order to create healthy soil, we need really good shit to compost, which means we have to have a willingness to let some of that stuff go into our roots and feed us so that we can grow whatever that medicine is that we're bringing into the world.
right. So in that worldview way of looking at it, trauma is kind of like the lever or the catalyst that allows you to grow and mature as a soul, as a human being, and evolve and then come back full circle and be of service to other people. I think that's kind of where it ends up.
I
Yeah.
think so, Lakshmi. Like that's been my, in my simple human way of making sense of my journey. That's I believe this is exactly what I came here to learn about, and I honestly wouldn't change any of it.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful, it's hard, it's all of those things. Something that I wouldn't have shared with you because it just wouldn't have been a part of our previous conversations. I have had a brother who was challenged with mental health and addiction problems all of his life, and he passed away a year and a half ago from a fentanyl overdose. And certainly the journey of being his sister and being with the challenge of his pain and grief and suffering and learning to show up in the ways that I could and let go of the ways that I couldn't, and also make peace with his overdose. I mean, all of these are part of our willingness to open our hearts, even when it's really hard, even when we really don't want to,
Well,
and not numb
absolutely.
ourselves out.
And new trauma, life hands you new traumas.
It's
It's not,
going to, yeah,
it's
yeah,
just,
exactly. Right? Like it doesn't finish and we never arrive
well,
until we
yeah,
die. And so there's that part too of just that deepening into we always have so much that we can learn about who we are. And I want to speak to, I was thinking about something that you said regarding there can be that real low part after a psychedelic journey as we're, scrambling to figure out in our human brain how we alchemize the awarenesses that have come through our psychedelic experience and somehow fit them into who we are in our lives, making the appropriate changes. And, I feel like that low part is also there because of the time that we are spending in the underworld, like in that deep soul investigating place that is true, that is a real part of our human journey. And we've bought into this story in Western culture anyway, that our goal is to be happy. Our goal is to come into this place in our life where if we've arrived, we're in that state of happy, healthy equilibrium all the time. And that's just not a true part of being human. And this is where I encourage people to bring grace to their integration and to choose the simple things that they can carry forward. Because the ecstatic experiences of the psychedelic help us to remember the truth of our being when we're not incarnated in a physical form. But we are in a physical form, which means that there's dense and heavy things that we need to care for in the day to day. And certainly we can sit vigil with the parts that we remember through our psychedelic journeys,
right.
and caring for them in our day to day means trusting that it's okay for us to be with what's heavy. Those are parts of what's real. Then we're not bypassing. If
Right.
we're just waiting for that spiritual high to show up again of, wow, look at how connected I am and how I can remember the deep truth of who I am, then we're not actually having the human experience that we came here to have.
Yeah, that is so well said. Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of this Taoist saying, heavy is the root of light. Heavy
Mm,
is the root of light.
mm,
And and that's exactly what it is. What you're talking or speaking to is that understanding that reverence and the heavy things, the grief, you can give reverence to grief and reverence to your journey of healing your own relationship with grief and with those who caused it or what caused it, the situation, whatever it is. There are so many ways in which it can come to you, and our culture doesn't promote that. It doesn't celebrate those heavy things.
yeah. And those are that's what's asking to be tended to in our quiet moments. Think about midlife for most people. There's a challenge with going to sleep because often it's in the night where all of a sudden all of these things are asking to be noticed or paid attention to in the nervous system. I think it's the parts of our life's journey that we haven't made space to be still with. And all of a sudden, each day, there's a little bit of stillness, and 50 years worth of stuff starts to come to the surface. There is so much grief that needs to be processed and digested within each and every human. And so, trusting in what's coming through our body, I think, is one of the biggest pieces, and trusting that you're capable of tending to it.
That's a big one. Like trusting that you're capable of doing it, and just once you trust that, and it might, you have to trust it in the face of perhaps feeling overcome by emotion or weak, or feeling not feeling it necessarily. But as soon as you start trusting it, you can feel your strength returning to you in that moment. Yeah, so much of it is a felt sense, and it's happening in these little moments. What you're talking about, like I just wanted to again underscore that those spontaneous meditations, or that you had, rituals that happened to you, I've had those too without plant medicines.
Hmm.
Our consciousness is a amazing and profound ally for our own healing once we get into conscious relationship with it. And you know, so a lot of things like that will open up for a person um, seeking to heal themselves, because I think it was ask and you shall find. That sentiment is true.
Hmm. Hmm. It's that, it's been my experience that what I put out there to the universe is what I get back. So if there is that deepening of this is possible and I can listen, it also means that we don't reject what we're receiving,
Mm.
right? Because as I said, there's all of this undigested grief, which means allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable. Right? And often throughout the course of, a busy day as a human in Western culture, if you're taking 15 minutes, a half an hour to meditate or do some journaling or take some time with yourself, there's going to be a part of us that wants that to be a good space of going inwards. This
Yeah.
is my peaceful time, not necessarily I'm going to feel uncomfortable and feel crappy things and go into what's been hard. And yet, if we don't make the space to tend to that, that is what fires out through our reactions in day-to-day life because it
Right.
needs to be addressed.
Right. It's
We
been
are often
someone.
erupting. Yeah, we're erupting from the unaddressed grief or trauma of our younger self. And so that needs to be cared for. And that's where that commitment shows up to make that space to listen and to go into the body. Healing can't happen in our heads.
Yeah, so that's a big, I think that's really important, that what you're saying about making space for it to happen. um, a few things that you said. One about, I had amnesia about my own trauma, childhood trauma, until I was 50, and that's when it surfaced. And then I had to go through a healing journey of many years, and there are still traces or layers of the onion of it that I'm dealing with, but I'm for the most part okay. But that's what I want to point out, is that trauma doesn't necessarily come up the first time you do a psychedelic
Mm,
medicine,
mm,
or even the third time or the 300th time. It
yeah.
sometimes depends on when you're ready. And sometimes it may not happen until you're 50 or above, because now you're mature enough and you're grounded enough
Mm,
in yourself to be able to deal with this inner child or whatever didn't get addressed. So that's one thing. Um, that I just wanted to call attention to, that about trauma, that you can't predict when it's going to happen or when it's going to surface.
hmm. Hmm. We don't. That's another piece of being willing to be with the unexpected, right? And what tools do we have in place to be with the unexpected? I mean, we certainly all got to explore some of our response to the unexpected during the COVIDian era. And, hopefully through that recognitions of our how we react to what we can't control has encouraged a deeper level of awakening and listening into what's present in our bodies and what do we need to care for,
Right.
right? There's again, it's that how do we engage with and respond to life. uh, Something I'd like to go deeper into too, Lakshmi, is the recognition of creating medicine out of our suffering. And often in the West, it comes back to we want it to be something that we can almost declare. here's the thing that I got from doing the thing, and that therefore must justify or make me credible because I now have this thing. And yet the truth is that there are no things. And that it's actually through allowing our relationship with ourselves and the world to change that we generate medicine. And so it's a deepening more fully into who we are. I certainly could not name the medicine that I have cultivated through mom's death in one specific thing, you know, because it's actually been more of a way in which I'm able to look at life and open my eyes. So
Right.
a deepening in trust, a recognition that forgiveness is true. It's a real thing. Like it's a when we actually, again, this it comes back to a decision. Make a decision that forgiveness is a part of our practice, not a place we get to. Because quite often, somebody that we forgive, we're going to have to forgive them again. But it's a part of our practice, you know.
Mm.
And again, it's lifted up through freedom. It's that willingness. Show me, how do I dress these bonds, this bondage that I feel towards this person in my
So
own being.
can you speak to that in terms of bright eyes and your personal, like, what was that? Did you come to a point, like, what was that like? The forgiveness that you're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah. I was somewhat resistant to the idea for some time, and certainly it could just be through some of the framework in our culture of where there's this idea that you should or I tend to have a bit of a anarchist approach sometimes to systems. I think I'd shared with you the other day, Lakshmi, that part of my late 40s and now 50 is allowing for healthy systems to show up in my life. But anyway, and
You and
so
all of us.
right. And so after I'd had this experience, of compassion, uh, that
Drink baking
digested.
soda with lemon before bed and watch your
I don't know what's going on. Okay, it's gone.
That's okay. After
Goodness.
I'd had that experience of compassion and digested it for, probably a couple of years, I was taking a training. It was called the Inca Medicine Wheel. It is a training that would have come out of the Four Winds organization, which is American, but this was being taught in Northern Alberta. The year was about '06, and so maybe it wasn't years after the experience of compassion. It was while I was still in it. And anyway, we had to do a ceremony on our own outside, making mandalas and honoring, acknowledging all the teachers in our lives and out of things in nature. And so I had gathered all of these different things, flowers, leaves, sticks, without knowing what they were going to represent. I just intuitively gathered all of these things and I set them down in a place that felt like the right place to be communing with spirit over the course of the 4 days I was there. And um, with each object that I picked up, I named who the teacher was and I gave thanks and I put it into my mandala. And I get to the last object and said to myself, oh, I wonder who that is. And as soon as I picked it up, I felt, oh, that's Peter Bright Eyes. He's actually one of your life's greatest teachers.
Mm.
And I probably wanted to throw up and open at the same time, like that. The truth of it, it was so true. I couldn't get away from the truth of it, and I
Mm.
couldn't lie. And so, in that awareness, as I felt into it and acknowledged that it was real, then I said to myself, Sarah, I think you need to forgive him. I think you have to say it out loud. It's time. And so that was when I spoke it out loud for the first time. It was so it was inclusive for me of recognizing, acknowledging, and claiming the teachings that I had received from him showing up in my life. Not to say that murder is okay, not to say that his actions were okay. Um, you know, being with any sense inside of my being that, well, if I said that, he was getting to have a part of me that he shouldn't get to have. Like any of those pieces that can show up with forgiveness. I was probably out there on that hill for a while, really had to be with what was true. And when I was able to, I said the words out loud, put my breath into the offering and placed it in the mandala. And that was actually, probably a year or two before I went to connected with Satellite Cree First Nation in Alberta and worked with the former chief, Eric Large, and before I met his sister. And so it it brought such a deep sense of liberation into my life because it actually wasn't planned. I would say the intention behind everything is still freedom and to be honest. And so as I sat in the truth of what was coming through for me, that was a natural part of metabolizing compassion.
Mm.
It was, and then over the course of time, because this is now 20 years ago, there have been other moments in the cycles of my own life where contraction and pain has come up around mom's death, and I've had to be with it again in a different way,
Mm.
and be honest about my anger or honest about what was true in that moment and potentially go through a forgiveness practice again. And I don't have a specific thing that I do, more of when I'm noticing that I'm really holding someone else accountable for how I'm feeling inside of my own body. I've got work to do.
I see. Well, that's a really good way to characterize it, of holding
Yeah.
someone accountable. So, how frequently, I mean, when was the last time something like that happened? And, you know, do you expect that it will happen? That is that like a lifelong thing? It might be.
I think it's true for all of us in our human experience. Like if you think about family of origin, I certainly know that there's times where I've had to forgive my mom for things in different ways, or my dad, things that I felt like I had come to peace with at some point, and then cycles of life show up, and you go, ugh, and it's just there. And so the last time that might have come up with bright eyes, Lakshmi, I can't think of one specifically right now, probably because in the last few years more of what I've been being with really intentionally would be my brother's death and you know the the
Yeah.
pain around addiction in our world,
Did your
the
brother
lack of
have a harder time dealing with your mom? Did your brother than
he
you?
certainly, I would say in some ways, but I would say also like both my brother and I did a lot of LSD really young. And one of the things about LSD is that you need a strong sense of constitution where you can trust in yourself, um, and then allow the substance to guide you. And when I think back to some of those early years, I would say that my brother didn't. Yeah, he didn't have a sense of self. So it's like 13, 14, 15. He also was on Ritalin as well as exploring a lot of other street substances. So he was diagnosed with a lot of different mental health stuff around the age of 18. The diagnosis changed through the years, schizophrenic, hypomanic, schizoaffective. Uh, they just continuously change. So as I reflect on that, particularly in the use of psychedelics, I can see the combination of antidepressants for kids with psychedelic substances and just a real challenge for him in trusting in a framework to go in and do some of that deep work.
So it's self-trust, but it's also, it's kind of intuition. Like what I observe about you is that you have a really strong intuition, and
Mm.
you allow yourself to go into this thing and not have a plan, and go within and trust that the answers are going to show up. And that trust is really important. And perhaps women have a better, um, I don't know if this is true or not, but I think it might be that uh, following a felt sense of something is more comfortable for women than for men, generally speaking. And I think that's one of the things. Do you have any advice for people about how to cultivate that? And then the other question, well, yeah, just do you have any advice for people about how to cultivate that kind of intuition? Um,
Certainly, a lot of the meditations, I actually have free ones on my YouTube that are connected to my book that are really helpful. And so, what I would speak to is it's essential that we can come into a place of yes no awareness inside of our body and inside of our belly. But you can't see down. My hand is touching my belly when I say that. Um, and which means meditations that help you to get that felt sense of how do I listen to my yes no? How do I trust my yes no? How do I know that that's real? So it's commitment to really go into it and unpack it. The fact is that all of us receive intuitive impulses all the time, but from a really young age, we've learned to shut that down. And so what we're often looking for in a decision is how do I pick the right one for this situation?
mhm,
And of course, choosing the right one for a situation is often based on our ideas of how we will have our needs met from our early formative years, right? What's the right thing to bring to this? When we're wanting to really dive into our intuition, you're going to come up against and notice discomfort when you follow what your body is telling you and there's a conflict with what your old habit or routine might have been. In
mhm.
placating or pandering or pleasing or adjusting yourself to suit the circumstances of what you believe are the expectations of who you should be.
Of other people, basically.
Exactly. And so as we go deeper into our own felt sense, some of that investigation always includes looking at the patterning that we have of when we override our intuitive impulses. The times where we received intuitive impulses and we didn't listen. So the times that we've betrayed ourselves. You know, a really simple one for that applies to any of us, and I certainly break this one, would be you're reaching for food that you know is not good for you.
Right.
Okay, it could be chips, could be a sugary sweet something, you know, you're reaching for it and your body's like, I don't think that's a good idea. And your head's like, just a little bit. I'm just gonna have a little. It'll be okay. You know, and you eat it and your body's like, I don't know, but your mouth's like, but those salt and vinegar chips are so good. And, you know, that would be a really small example, but that happens for many of us on a regular basis of where our body tells us something and our head overrides it,
Right.
right? And so it's making more space to listen to what the body is telling us and to
Right.
follow through. So some of the exercises I have in trauma as medicine are really clear
Do you have a
in,
YouTube channel?
yes, I do have a YouTube channel and there's a few exercises on there in looking at paying attention to your energy body as well. And the more that we're able to bring awareness to our energy body, so the space that we take up from front to back, side to side, above and below, the more we're conscious of the space that we're holding, the easier it is for us to listen to our intuitive impulses because we're here in our whole body.
Yeah. That sounds great. That sounds great. It's a very simple, practical way of doing this kind of thing. The other thing that I found to be very simple is, and I really learned this through doing psychedelic journeys where your energy is going so fast that if it goes into some space you don't want it to be, a very simple thing is to do something else to shift the energy. Like if you're sitting, stand. If you're inside, go outside. If you're, you know, take a shower, like shift the energy. And you can do that very quickly rather than uh, being in some thought loop that you really don't want to be inside of. So I just want to point that out, that sometimes it's as simple as that.
Mhm. And so then the question would be, how do we do that in our day to day, right? If we are using that as a means in which to help us in changing our perspective in a psychedelic experience, there's a good chance that there's ways that we can utilize that in our day to day. And certainly movement, exercise, things that things that change the routine,
Yeah.
right? We have to change the routine. We have to have the discipline to change the routine because then you're going to receive something different from your experience with the universe. And so that's really integral. Changing the routine also helps us in addressing trauma because we're now getting a different vantage point. What I really want to impart is the awareness that there's nothing too big for you to address. And often what inhibits our willingness to go in is we might think it's too big. Nobody can help me. This is too big. I know that was some of my story. It's not big enough.
Yeah.
It's not big enough. Like, oh wow, you went through that. Mine's nothing. I shouldn't even have a thing. And so the judgment, right? How we measure our experience. And really all of it is just different avoidance strategies built into our psyche, likely from our ego to protect us, keep us safe, you know? And yet over the course of time, they do more harm than good. And so it's recognizing our avoidance strategies
Right.
and letting yourself soften into curiosity. What if you softened into curiosity after getting off this call and just let yourself wonder, what is a way that I can be with that heaviness that I've been feeling in my life today that's different from how I was with it yesterday, you know? Bringing it into the mythos in our day to day. As you said, you've had a lot of experiences, Lakshmi, out of the psychedelic realm, as have I. And the mythos is here all the time, not just in the psychedelic framework. And so if this trauma, had a face or a shape or a way that you could be in relationship with it differently, so it doesn't feel like it has power over you, but you can address it, what would that be? Bringing as many approaches to how you can shift your perspective that acknowledges that there already is a relationship, you're already walking with it. If it
Mhm.
was a bundle, how would you carry it differently? Is it like a whole bunch of rocks weighing you down on your back? Or is it something in a basket that you can bring into the world as a
Yeah.
gift? Like, how are you carrying these things?
Yeah,
And if it's, yeah, please.
often you can resolve something like that by deciding to go on a creative journey, like writing a book or making a painting or a song, or you know a lot of times that's what's happening when people do that with difficult experiences. They create an expression for it, and in the moving through that expression, it heals a lot of things because you've created a container for to move through it. So that's another strategy that somebody, and you use that strategy with your book, Trauma as Medicine, did you not?
Absolutely. Yes, certainly. Like one of the reasons for the writing of the book, first off, it certainly was healing for me. And, I worked on it for about 10 years and then got rid of almost completely the first manuscript and then did it all again over the course of a year. Um, so there was the part that was for me to understand it. And then there was also, I had been teaching workshops and doing talks or classes for quite a few years at that point, and certainly recognized that it would be helpful for people to have a takeaway, something that could help them to really root more deeply into some of what I was sharing or teaching about. So creating a container that helps us to be with, what is sacred to us and what our souls are crying out for. And essentially it's taking the time to do that. So creative project, certainly artwork is really helpful for somebody in expressing their relationship with trauma. I love gardening and working outside, finding ways that you can connect and be with yourself and your trauma in a different way.
Mm.
Again, that's always what you're looking for. How can I be with it differently? Unless what you're doing now is working for you, and then great. But if
Right.
it's not working for you, then knowing we're the only ones who can do something different. That means meeting the energy that says this is impossible inside of us and instead inviting in that curiosity. What if that's not true? And I'm wondering, Lakshmi, if we can make some space for questions from
Yeah,
um, I see a few things. I have to put my transitions on.
I just stopped taking them off.
Thank you, Caroline. How can I, so how can I react differently? So Caroline, can you give me, um, do you want to turn your microphone on and ask more specifically?
I can spotlight you if you want, Caroline. Hmm. Not seeing you. Let's see. I don't know why I'm not able to see you in the gallery. Oh, there it is. Okay, I just got. Can you turn on your video or your audio, either one, Caroline? Oh, oh, you said you're just processing in real time. It's cool. Okay, you don't have
Okay,
it.
that's okay. I'll do my best. I'm going to do my best to answer. So how can I react differently? First off, what I would suggest is making space to be curious about that and ask your own body. One of the practices that's one of my favorites, Caroline, is bringing my hands to the parts of my body where I'm feeling contraction or where I'm noticing that I'm holding most of the energy around the trauma that I'm addressing. And that seems to just be really helpful for acknowledging it. And so bringing my hands there and then just starting to allow for some curiosity. That can be saying to yourself, okay, like what I'm doing right now isn't working, but I don't know a different way, you know? Help, show me a different way. What could be a different way? And I mean, whatever your connection is with spirit, I still call them our come to Jesus moments, but whatever it is, as far as coming into that reckoning that you need some help in changing your perspective and you don't have the answers. And the truth is, none of us have the answers. The deeper I go in my own healing journey, I've been doing a lot of breath work this year. And even in my own psychedelic journeys, what comes through is, Sarah, you don't have any answers. There's no answers.
I know nothing.
Yeah, yeah. You know what we're giving you? Nothing.
And
Because
then,
there's no things,
yeah, put a hyphen
right?
in there. No thing.
Because there isn't anything. There's this moment, there's this breath, there's this deepening, there's this curiosity. And so that's where I would start with something that feels really obstructive and tight. If I can react differently, whether it's reacting to what you're holding in your own body or reacting to something that's happening outside of you.
Right.
You need to make space to ask the question and listen. How is the universe responding? And whether to you, the universe is the collective whole of the wisdom of humanity, whether that's God, whether that's the intelligence of the Tao, whatever that is for you, what can you make space to listen to? And answers always come through. right? So it's space for that curiosity, space for listening, and even just the knowing that there is a different way. There is a different way that we can react because as soon as we're bound to a habit of reaction, we're tied into a certain way of seeing ourselves in the world. And
Right.
our attachment to that, especially when we see someone, people doing harm, right? To let go of that reaction, it's like, well, am I now saying that what they're doing is okay or that
Now,
they're justified?
how do you deal with forgiving someone who is still doing the thing that you found unforgivable
Who
in the
is
first
still
place?
doing the thing,
Yeah.
right? And again, I don't have an answer for that. It's going to be, it's going to be different for everybody. What we're asking in our human experience is how do I come into a place of balance within myself so I'm not rendered powerless by my activations and my triggers? That I'm able to recognize and identify that what's happening, whether it's to me, in me, or around me, though I need to pay attention to it, it's also not who I am. And so when we can resource ourselves in a deeper recognition of who we are, it gives us a greater capacity to be with the hard things, not to bypass the hard things, but to be with them in a way that hopefully then offers up a different perspective for all of the world. Whereas if we're in reaction to the, like let's think of some of the collective social challenges that are happening on our planet. If we're in reaction to them because they're so unjust and they're so unfair and they're so despicable and they're so awful, all of those things, though that's true, if we're in reaction, then we are insisting that there's a bad guy and that there's someone else's fault. And from a collective point of view, we can't find a different resolution forward.
Right.
Right? So that's the piece. It doesn't excuse what somebody is doing, but it says, okay, what if as humans we stop doing the same thing? We have addressed war, conflict, injustice the same way forever. And then we get the same result. And
Right.
so and so how can we take a breath and pause before we react,
Mm.
even if the aggressor is still aggressing?
Yeah, I think here's where this idea of a fractal hologram, that we live inside a fractal hologram. And this is the truth, one of the truths that you see when you're doing psychedelic journeys. And so if you're inside this hologram and everything is interconnected, and if you can shift yourself, then the whole hologram around you changes because of that shift in yourself. It's just like a slinky, you're connected to everything.
Yeah.
And so this is how I have done it sometimes, where I need to shift, and I need to shift my own response to the situation, even just even just a little bit, maybe fractionally at a time. But that shift then leads to a new direction in my life. It has to, if you just look at it and in like geometry, it has to create a new direction and a new pattern. And so
Yeah.
then you start to change your life that way.
Yeah, it does create a new pattern. It makes me think of something I used to do in some programs I taught years ago is that included cycle teachings. So working with the life, death, rebirth, cycles of our own journey, as well as the wheel of the year, is if we place in the center whatever it is that we're addressing, and we slowly move around the circle, it looks different from every point of view.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we're looking for when we're wanting breathing space. How can I see this differently? I often imagine us humans that we have the collective awareness of like 13 or 14-year-olds, across the planet. And so if we can recognize that and then also have some level of benevolence of the creator, of Mother, Father, God, and how would Mother, Father, God speak to these 13, 14-year-olds that don't seem to have it figured out? That's helpful for me in my addressing of what's happening in the world and just going, oh, you guys all screwed up again. you know, the militant punishment doesn't work. What, like looking at all of like what can actually work and how can I embody that in my life as just this simple human going through a simple experience day to day, right? How can we be a part of that? And it's through some of that reconciling of our own stuff.
It's not easy. The Bhagavad Gita says that war is a part of life. You're going to have war, you're going to have conflict because people are at different levels of evolution. You can't, it's never going to be universal, or forever peace. It's a hard one. It's a hard one to reconcile yourself to how the world is, and how you want it to be, you know.
Exactly. And that circles back to the beginning of our conversation and the deepening into we get to choose what we do and how we be in relationship with what shows up. But we don't have control over so many of the other variables that have either happened to us or are happening around us. We do have power over choosing how we show up with it. And if we come from that framework, then we're able to find the resources that we need to move forward to the best of our ability, right? It's okay that we're fallible. This is what we came here to learn about.
Yeah.
We don't want our fear of doing it the right way or it not being perfect or the challenge of going into uncertainty to keep us from taking that step. These are little steps that lead us towards acts of and experiences of freedom and liberation.
Yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said. You're just such a beautiful person. Thank you so much for really, really
Well, thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you for having me on
how you.
your call today. Are there more questions? Anything else anyone would like to throw into the chat? I think we have time for one more.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about what kind of work you do, and well, we have 10 more minutes, about what you do and how you can be reached, and just a little bit more elaboration on that would be really great.
Certainly. And so my website is my name, so sarahsalterkelly.com. And as Lakshmi has shared, I have a book, Trauma as Medicine. That's probably the best way. You can order it through my website, but if you're ordering from the States, it's probably best to order through Indigo or through Amazon, right? Or Ingram Sparks, I think it is. And so that would be one of the first ways. The following would be I offer retreats that include psilocybin and sometimes wachuma. The main retreat center I work out of is in Western Canada, maybe 4 hours north of Washington. And typically my retreats are 5 days or more. Part of the reason for that is to allow space for integration and for the digestion of what shows up. The focus in all of my events is supporting you and connecting with the sacred. And so it's very different from, I don't have a clinical background in psychedelics. I've held my own private healing practice through Reiki, Andean shamanism, alchemical healing, and other energy modalities for 20 years. And so the background is all coming from that recognition of energy. How do we be with what we're identifying inside of our body? How do we take ownership of our own agency and trust in our own authority so that we can carry that forward in a good way in our lives? And how do we commit to our relationship with the sacred? And so I have a retreat coming up in July 22nd to 27th. I think there's still a couple spots left in that, and that includes Wachuma. I have one in September, end of September, with two psilocybin ceremonies. We also work with Hape, and we have some microdose ceremonies as well. And then I offer trainings. And so my trainings, I have one in September, 10 days in person, the rest is online for those who are feeling called to earth medicine. So those who are feeling called to initiations with understanding cycle teaching, soul retrieval, shamanic journey, and the rest of the program is online throughout the year.
Wonderful.
Yeah, another main program I teach is a ceremonial medicine program, and that next one will start in a year. And that's for people who are interested in supporting others with psilocybin, one-on-one practice and group.
So thank you so much, Sarah. Sarah is also part of the Awake Mentors and Masters programs. You can find her on the Awake directory. And hopefully you'll see her on one of our breakthrough lectures, which is our 9-month integration program called Change Your Character, which we're going to be launching it very soon. And that's kind of how we met. Sarah came on to Awake. And so happy to have you share your wisdom, because it's really profound and it's simple at the same time. Um, so I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody here does. And so the recording will be up on YouTube. AwakeNet 888 is the YouTube address, and it'll also be on awake.net under Ibogaine, and it'll be on social media as well in a few days from now.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all of you who made space out of your day to come and be a part of the call.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Okay. Blessings. Enjoy the rest of your day.